Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. Again, my name is Carrie Tupa, and I'm excited to talk to you all a little bit more about the information that you all talked about at the Regional Accountability event. I am joined with Mahalia Baldini, who is our Supervisor for Technical Assistance, and is going to be on to help field questions as needed, and is slowly becoming an expert at this stuff. And then Charmaine Costin as well, who's going to be keeping an eye on the chat pod and also helping to alert me to questions as they come in. Charmaine has been gracious enough to populate out our training environment with a whole lot of information so that we have some good things to kind of look at today as we go over the report. So in terms of our goals for today, we're going to be reviewing just some real brief information about the Regional Accountability event. This information is obviously you talked about quite a bit during those day-long events, so I want to kind of hone in on a few key takeaways to make sure everybody's clear before we start talking about the report here today. It's going to be really important that you remember some of these key pieces that you talked about in kind of understanding how these reports work. So I'm going to take a little bit of time and just kind of review some of those key points really quickly before we actually get into the session. We are then going to get into the actual POP report and POP report extract and talk a little bit about how that works, what it's showing you, so that you can understand a little bit more about how to use that report in your day-to-day. And then we will move into the POP report and how it can actually be used in day-to-day program management. I will tell you this webinar covers a lot of information related to the report and kind of what the report is showing you. We will definitely need to do kind of a part 2 to get a little bit further into the weeds to understand kind of all the different ways that you can use this report. And the more questions we receive and the more times I spend doing this, or time I spend doing this rather, I'm able to kind of get a better idea of how this report is usable for ways that we didn't even necessarily envision when we first came up with it. I will say that we are working on some templates and some guides and things like that that help kind of show you better how you can align the information that's found in this report with the information that's found in the other team's reports that are not yet remediated, so that you can, again, get the most use out of this report for your day-to-day program. One thing I want to talk about really quickly before I go into kind of some key takeaways from the Regional Accountability event is just kind of a refresher on how we are rolling out the periods of participation in teams. Many of you have heard me say on numerous occasions, the periods of participation are definitely one of the more complicated pieces of the WIOA overhaul in teams, and as such, there's a lot of work that had to be done to make the periods of participation possible. So we have actually split that work into 3 phases. This particular report is done in 3 phases, or the POPs rather, in teams are done in 3 phases, the first of which is this POP report or POP extract. As some of you have heard me say, this alone was kind of a year of undertaking, because in the development of this, we really had to go in and understand how the periods of participation were working, understand how teams was calculating certain things, and get us to a point where we could actually calculate the periods of participation in teams. So being able to accomplish this was a huge undertaking and really accomplishes a bulk of what is needed to calculate periods of participation in teams. The second phase in this is going to be the ability for us to look at assessments around periods of participation. Some of the initial questions we got related to kind of understanding this report was, why aren't assessments in there? And quite a few of you have heard me say on numerous occasions we can't remediate the assessments or add the assessments to any reports until we actually recalculate how teams view assessments around periods of participation. So if you think about some of the examples that you saw at those regional accountability events, there's times where in periods of participation, a test may be considered a pre-test, it may be considered a post-test. So just little things like that are all hard-coded in the system around how the system recognizes a test. And so we have to, again, unravel everything to make it work around periods of participation to accurately calculate performance. So that is what we are working on right now. I'm hoping it is a fairly quick process, but as with everything, it usually winds up being more complicated than we anticipate. So as soon as that piece is finished, we will be able to then add assessments to reports, remediate the reports and teams that have assessments in them. But we can't do that until we fix how the system recognizes assessments. And then the third phase is the kind of final piece of taking the participant profile, unraveling that from a program year basis, and moving it into a period of participation basis so that the system is not asking for those barriers to employment every single program year, but rather is looking for them in the period of participation. So those are the three phases that we're working on. I apologize. I wish I had better timelines. Unfortunately, I can't even give a due date until we have the initial analysis for something done. So phase 2, we're still working on the analysis, so I don't have a due date or an anticipated date at this time, except to share that we're working as quickly as possible because we know how important this is. So those are kind of the three phases that we are working on to being able to realize periods of participation in teams. But as I mentioned earlier, our goal with this report was to make something that could be used in conjunction with other existing information to be able to give you as much information as possible in the system right now until we finish all of the remediation. So with that, I want to go back to kind of cover some key information from the regional accountability events. Again, this information, I just kind of want to refresh to make sure that it's fresh on your mind, because as we start to talk about these reports, it's going to be really important for you to remember these. So the first of these is related to participation, and this is something that's really, really important to understanding around periods of participation, and that's that things are no longer really related to the program year when it comes to when you start and stop being a participant. Things are purely based on you starting and becoming participants and continuing participation. Many of you have heard me say this before: a participant is a participant until they aren't. It's inconsequential of program years, and you don't need 12 contact hours each program year to be considered a participant for that program year. That's an absolutely critical piece of information and critical to keep in mind as we start working on looking at these reports. The next of this is that those contact hours carry over across program years unless a participant exits. And one thing I really want to stress before we start getting into this report is when we talk about hours today, we're talking about hours in the context of participation. This training, this webinar, has nothing to do with hours between a pre-post test. That is a whole separate topic. So our focus today is purely on a participant getting, acquiring, maintaining contact hours because that's what's important for you to understand when we take a look at the period of participation report. So push the hours between pre-post test kind of to the back of your mind. That's kind of the next phase or the next topic that's going to be important for you to understand related to periods of participation. And then I wanted to kind of reiterate that certain activities, also known as participatory services, continue a period of participation. So this includes tests other than high school equivalency exams, career services, direct contact hours, proxy contact hours, and training hours for up to 60 days after direct or proxy hours end. So all of this information, important to keep in mind that those services actually continue a period of participation. Now, following the regional accountability events, one of the questions we got from the first of these virtual trainings really kind of honed in on a really critical fine point related to continuing participation across the program year. I'm going to address that later on, but it has to do with kind of the understanding of continuing participation and then what actually includes you in certain measures once you are a participant in a particular program year. So we'll get into that in a little more detail as we get into teams and the team's environment. But again, wanted to kind of talk about some of those things. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the team's training environment. And I've actually got the team's training environment up, and then I've got our test environment up. I'm going to show you a few different things, but one of those I am going to have to go into a different environment for us to be able to take a look at. So hopefully all of you have taken the opportunity to go in, to start to look at this new report and kind of play around with it a little bit while you're in the system and understanding kind of how it works. But this is found under reports and then periods of participation. And that brings you to this screen here. And this particular screen has some important things on it that I'm going to kind of talk through as I talk about the period of participation report. But the first is to kind of understand what these different things mean. And there's sort of two different types of reports you can run, and then there's a report description. So the two types of reports we're going to take a look at is the summary report and the report extract. I will spend a whole lot more time on the report extract because it has a whole lot more information in it. But we will talk a little bit about the report summary. But I wanted to go ahead and take this opportunity to highlight the report description. And this report description, which you can get by clicking on that link, is actually now on the TCAL Teams page. So you don't have to be in Teams to get access to this. But what this does is this kind of outlines for you in that extract what the different columns are telling you. And so this is something to kind of keep handy, make notes on, get familiar with, and kind of take a look at as you are working with these reports and teams. And thank you, Train PD, for sharing that report link in the chat pod, or the description link in the chat pod. So this, very handy for understanding kind of what the report is telling you. So the first thing I want to talk about is the report summary. And the report summary is a report that is very similar to or is like the other reports that we have in Teams. It's run using what's called crystal reports. It gives you different options for extracting, and it is just that. It's a summary. It doesn't have the level of detail that the extract has on it. It just has the core information related to periods of participation, so it can be useful for a variety of things and kind of at-a-glance information about individuals that have a period of participation, but is indeed just a summary. So you'll notice that the first thing you have to do when you run these reports is you have to put in the start date and end date of your report, and that's because it's not going to recognize the grant recipients that you're going to run the report for until you've actually put in those dates. So this is very important, kind of first step in running the report. And then from there, for this particular report, I want to point out the report options. The report options for the summary report, the prevalent or the relevant one is going to be this checkbox here, which indicates participants. And the reason this is here is because this report is going to give you anybody who has any type of participation in the period that you run for. And what I mean when I say that is they may not yet have been a participant, meaning they had reached 12 direct contact hours, but they were engaging in your program in one way or another within that time frame. So you can actually run this report and say, I only want to see people who actually were participants during this time frame, as opposed to anybody that had any type of engagement, otherwise known as a reportable individual. For the purposes of what I'm going to run today, though, I'm just going to run it for the full group of individuals, and I'm going to go ahead and run my report summary. Now, the one thing you will have heard us say on the kind of introductory webinar to this release of Teams is that this does take a while to run, and the reason that is the system is calculating everything in real time. So if you were to go in and update information and run the report again, and an individual, let's say, had been in Exeter and now is not in Exeter, so on and so forth, that's all going to calculate in real time. And that's very valuable because it helps you see things as they are happening. The other option for these reports was to have everything run at night so that the report itself would run a lot quicker. But what that would mean is you would have to wait until the next day to see up-to-date information, which isn't always beneficial when we're talking about service, a type of service that is very, very rapidly changes. An individual status kind of very quickly changes. So we wanted this information to be as current as possible, but also as meaningful as possible. But as such, it does mean that, particularly for those of you that are in larger areas, it does take a little bit of time to run. So what I've run here is the report summary. Again, this is the report summary for July 1st of this program year through November of this program year. And I'm going to kind of walk through the different pieces of this report and explain what the different areas mean. So first, we obviously just have the participant name, and then we get into the participant ID. The participant ID is something that we have newly visible in this release of Teams. It's something that's always been there. Many of you knew how to access it actually from the URL of a participant screen. But what that essentially is it's the record number of a participant. It is the after they got added, it is the literal number that they are in the system. And what that provides for us is a way to talk about a participant in email, et cetera, without sharing personally identifiable information. This information was really important for us to be able to have in the system, have present and prevalent, so that as we're kind of moving on here, we are able to more easily identify information about individuals. The next piece of information is the date of birth, pretty obvious, and then you have participant flag and reportable individual flag. And this is telling you for this period that you've run, what was the status of the individual within this time frame. The participant flag and the reportable individual flag will always be different. And what I mean when I say that is if you're a participant, you cease to become a reportable individual and vice versa. If you're a reportable individual, you are not a participant. Participant means you've reached those 12 direct contact hours, and so for the purpose of enrollment, et cetera, you are now in the mix. Reportable individual, again, just means some type of service has been provided for you within this time frame. So we, as TWC, actually report you to the feds on a few of the reports. But again, this is important to keep in mind that they will always be different, because once you cease to become a reportable individual, you start becoming a participant and vice versa. You then have the Exeter flag. And the Exeter flag indicates have 90 days passed since your last point of service. So again, this is always going to be no if 90 days have not passed. Now with this first individual, I'm going to explain why this is here in just a second, but just in general, keep in mind if 90 days have not yet passed, even if that individual is not receiving services until those 90 days have passed, this Exeter flag is going to be no. As soon as those 90 days have passed since their last service, this will become yes. Again, every single time you run this report, it's updating. So if you were to have an individual, 90 days had passed during their last service, you go in and add new data that now changes that, this report will be updated to reflect that. You then have their first direct contact hour date. This is the first date of the clock, for lack of a better word, where they have started to obtain direct contact hours for the purposes of becoming a participant. The participation start date is the date that this participant flag became yes. So that's the date that they reached those 12 direct contact hours. Participation date program year, all this is telling you is what was the program year where this individual started becoming a participant. You may pull the report for this year and have individuals in a wide variety of date ranges. And again, all that's really telling you is that this was the program year that this particular date started. You then have your last service date. This is the last date that that individual received what is considered a participatory service. So think back to that list of services that we talked about a second ago and at the regional accountability event. You have the number of days since their last service. This is starting that 90-day clock. This continues to reset itself as long as you are adding services. And then you have 90 days past the last service date. So essentially, what is the date that this exit flag over here will become yes if they don't have a service? Now, with the case of this first individual up here, this is very important because we have gotten a few questions. The reason this person has 108 days since their last service but doesn't have an exit flag is because they never became a participant. You cannot exit if you never become a participant, and you are not included in any of the exit-based measures. So while this person has gone 108 days since their last service, they never reached the point of becoming a participant, therefore they did not exit. Now with this example, if I added in contact hours up to the point of the last service date that got them to participant status, and their last service date was still 8/3, then this exiter flag would change to yes. So that is the summary report. Again, it's just a crystal report. You have the ability to extract it in a variety of different ways, search it as you do with all the other teams' reports. I'll go ahead and stop there, and please do not wait to put your questions in the chat pod. Don't wait for me. We're keeping a loose eye on it, so if something pops into your head while I'm talking, you can go ahead and throw it in there. But I'll go ahead and stop right here and ask if there's any questions. You can also raise your hand. We have a small enough group on the chat or on the line here that if you want to just ask your question orally, that's not a problem. Just raise your hand, and Train PD will happily unmute. I'll go ahead and stop here and make sure there's no questions. Okay, and I'm going to move forward, but again, if you think of something, please don't hesitate to put it in this chat pod down here. So now I'm going to move on, and we're going to start talking about the report extract. And the report extract really gives you the biggest dose of information, but it's really, really important to understand what the report is telling you and for the time period that it's telling you, because it does kind of mix snapshot information with real-time information, which, if you're not familiar with what it's showing you, can get a little confusing. So we're doing what we can to make that as clear as we can, so that as you start to play with the report, you become clear on what exactly you're looking at. But what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to go ahead and go back. I'm going to put in my date range. I'm going to put in my, my information here, and I'm going to run the report extract. I'm going to leave everything as is. You can opt to include the last 4 of Social Security numbers on the extract, but by default it does not. This does become important if you're using this report to compare to other reports using match functions and things like that in Excel, because especially if you have a lot of folks with the same name and potentially even date of birth, you're going to want to match across different fields in the system. But by default, it does not include SSNs. Again, as with the summary, you can choose to just do participants or do all individuals with any service during this time frame. And then you can pick how you order it before you run the report. But again, it's an Excel extract. So with any level of familiarity with Excel, you can sort, filter, play with the data however you want. So I'm going to go ahead and run my report extract here, and we're going to open this up, and we've got our report extract here. And again, this shout out to Charmaine for giving us a lot of information in the system to kind of talk through as we take a look at this. So for the purposes of kind of where we are right now, I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint real quick here. And I want to talk a little bit about the date and data periods for this report. And you're going to hear me say a lot, data as of the date you run for the date you run. And that can be a little confusing. And what I mean when I say that is different types or different fields in the report are current, meaning for the time period you run, what is the status for that particular period. And certain information is snapshotted, meaning during that time frame, what was the actual status. But this kind of tells you the time periods for the report shown and what the dates in the report are telling you. So as you saw, I just ran the extract. I ran it for essentially from the beginning of the program year to date, year to date. Information on the report that's current as of when you run the report, regardless of the date range, includes pretty much everything except the hours calculation. The hours calculation are a snapshot for the period that you run the report for. And this is going to make a lot more sense when I show you some examples where I've actually compared 2 different time frames of the report. But in a nutshell, if I, let's say, ran the report for the first month of the program year, and the person during the program year that I'm running it for had some participation in that time frame and then eventually became a participant, that participant flag is going to be yes, even though during that month time frame, they weren't yet a participant. And again, this is going to make a lot more sense with examples, but keep these little pieces of information in mind, but basically, like, to put it as simply as possible, items that are current as of when you run the report is going to be everything that's kind of a status or a status date. Items that are a snapshot, meaning they're going to change based on when you run the report and for what period, are going to be the calculation of contact hours. And the reason we did that was so that if you're looking across a particular time frame, you have enough information to tell you kind of what's needed for seeing what might need to be done with a participant regardless of when you ran the report, versus being able to look at how many hours did a participant acquire in the first month versus the second month, and things that you might need to actually be able to run some analysis on that you couldn't otherwise do. And again, this will make a whole lot more sense once we start looking at some examples. But I wanted to go ahead and kind of show you this, and I'll keep referring back to this. You'll hear me kind of refer back to this as we're going through this. So this report, again, I ran from 7/1 till today, 11/19. So what this report is telling me is this is telling me anybody that had any type of service from 7/1 to 7/19 and or had a status date during that time frame. So let's take a look real quick and look at some examples here. And again, I'm going to walk through some of these core pieces of information, these core column information. So participant ID we already talked about. Next we have participation ID. And for those of you who've kind of been playing with this report, you know that if you run this report for a longer time frame, you may have individuals with multiple periods of participation. If an individual has multiple periods of participation during the time frame that you run the report, they're going to have multiple rows. Now, that's not the case with William Becker. I'm going to explain William Becker here in just a second. But let's say Brian Barnes had 2 periods of participation within this time frame that I had run. This number would be a different number. And so by looking at this number, I can immediately see this is information for 2 different periods of participation. All this other information would be similar, if not the same, until I get to age of participation. Age of participation is always going to calculate what was the age that they were when they reached that 12 direct contact hours. So while your date of birth is obviously always consistent, your age of participation, depending on how far apart your PoPs were, could be different. The reason we did it this way is we wanted you, because this report was our first stab at doing anything with periods of participation, and we knew it was going to be as much as we could do right now and not be able to remediate all the reports and teams, we wanted to give you something that would allow you to be able to run who's got a PoP and who's in that 16 to 18 time frame, so that you can easily see at a glance who are you going to have that documentation for, because they were within compulsory age of attendance at participation. That's the only reason we added this age of participation time frame here. So that's the primary reason that we went with that age at participation time frame. The next piece across, we've got my participant flag, my reportable individual flag. We talked about this a little bit before, no difference in this report, but if you have an individual that has 2 periods of participation, and for the purposes of this report, we're just saying period of participation, even though they may not have received participant status, these 2 things could be different. You just never know, but it's 2 different sets of time frame and participant periods that this individual is being tracked for. We've got first direct contact hour, we've got participation start date. Obviously, these 2 things, first direct contact hour is the date that those 12 hours started calculating, and then that participation start date is when they actually reached those 12 direct contact hours. That participation start date program year. last service date, number of days since last service, so a lot of these things the same as on that summary report, and 90 days since last service. Moving on, you get into some information that is only on this report. You have your total basic education hours, so your direct and your proxy hours, total hours from everything, meaning direct, proxy, and training hours, the last date you had contact hours, and then you get into breakouts of direct hours, proxy hours, and training hours. And then you get into career services. So I want to take a second and talk a little bit about career services. Career services, this is the only report where we have career services right now. So career services are the only reason that you have individuals in this particular report that have 2 or more rows but don't have 2 or more participation IDs, meaning they don't have multiple periods of participation. So when you see a situation where you have an individual, you've got the same participation ID, you just have a name and no other information across that row, that's going to be a signal to you that this must be an individual that has multiple career services. And the reason this is the structure of this report is it's a set width. And we wanted to be able to have a situation where we could show you the everything for the system, or everything career service-wise that the individual had and not have to truncate, meaning we didn't want to set it up in such a way where we had, let's say last career service only, or only 3 career services, which is what would have been the case if we would have had it feed across horizontally as opposed to vertically. By setting it up this way, if a person has many, many career services, it allows us to have all of those on this particular report, and it doesn't matter that it is a set width. However, what that does mean is that if you have multiple career services within the time frame that you're running the report, you are unfortunately going to have multiple rows in the report. So a little key piece of information to understand why the report is running in such a way and why it's showing multiple rows. This is different than the situation that I was trying to demonstrate here, where someone might have 2 periods of participation. The information is going to populate all the way across for the second period of participation. But in the case of William Becker, and if we actually go back to Teams here, we can look up Mr. Becker real quick here, and we can see real quick here that Mr. Becker has multiple career and training services, and as such is going to have multiple columns on that report. Before I move into some more examples, I want to go ahead and stop, ask if there's any questions. So now I want to go back to my report, and I want to talk about some more kind of discrete examples of how this report is working.
Carrie, if I might interrupt, I had a comment that came through. You might want to run through that from Anson. Through that again, not sure why the horizontal is important, just very abstract.
Okay, so back to example, Anson's example, all I was explaining is why when you have multiple career services, you're going to have multiple rows instead of it the report going across this way. And what all you need to know is that the report is finite, meaning the report, you're not going to keep getting new columns in the report. It's not going to keep going and adding for career services. And so in order for you to be able to see all the career services that an individual has, you're going to have to add new rows of information, because that's the only way to keep showing that information. So that's really the key piece of information, or the key takeaway there, is that you're going to have if you have an individual with multiple career services, you're going to have multiple rows for that individual in the time frame. So kind of looking down as an example of all of these people, I can see all these people just have one career service because they don't have multiple rows in this particular report. Hopefully that helps a little bit. So to get into some more examples here, we've now kind of taken a look at running the report extract. So now I want to show you some information or some situations where you've got somebody who might have different things going on within a different time frame. So this kind of gets back, if I think back to my column or chart here that I showed you all earlier, and that is what is current for the time frame that you're running for the report, so a snapshot, so to speak, and what is as of the current date for this report. And this becomes really important when you start using the report for things like understanding who is included in the participation count that we say you have for a particular time frame. So I'm going to pull up a sample that I did before the training. And what I did here is I ran the same grantees report. I ran it for 2 different time periods. The blue that I have here, I ran for the first month of this program year, so just 7/1 to 7/31. The yellow, I ran for the first quarter, meaning I ran it from 7/1 to 9/30. And what I want to do is I want to kind of go through and show you, thinking back again to this chart here, what I mean when I say certain things are current as of when you run the report regardless of the date range, and certain things are a snapshot for the period you run the report for, and why it becomes really important to look at a lot of the information in the report to understand what's being counted, what's not being counted. Looking at this report here, I want to start by taking a look at row 10. And real quick, what I did here is I kind of pulled this for the first month, and where you see blanks indicate that I had a situation where I had somebody start later in the year. So when I ran the first report, they weren't on there yet, but when I ran the second, they were. And I'm going to change my phrase here real quick so that I can scroll all the way over here, and I'm going to unhide. And so if I take a look at row 10 here, William Brewster was not on the report when I ran the report for 7/1 through 7/30, and that's because nothing for him was going on during that time frame, and he wasn't anything, for lack of a better word, during that time frame. But if I scroll over, I can start to see that William Brewster had a first direct contact hour on 9/3, participation start date on 9/6, so on and so forth. And so again, this kind of shows you, if I were to just run the report for that first month, during that month he didn't have anything going on, but he also wasn't a participant. So he's not going to appear in that report, versus other people, like let's say William Becker up here, who had a participation start date that was in that first month, first direct contact hour in that first month, etc. The other thing I want to show you is that the participation start date, and again, think back to this chart here, the participation start date is always going to give you the most recent information. So let's look at Lowell here. Lowell's participation start date wasn't until 8/1, but because Lowell had some services going on during the time frame that I ran the report for, he's going to show up. But because I'm running this report after the time that he became a participant, it's going to give me the most up-to-date information for him. Now, if I had run this report, let's say back on 7/31, for 7/31, this information wouldn't be there yet. But because it's now November, the report says, hey, I know this important piece of information, so even though it didn't apply to this particular month, I now have it. I'm going to tell you what's going on during this particular month for this particular month. And the reason this is important is, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to run this report again real quick so that I can show you. When you start to use this report for things like seeing who is, let's say, being counted in your participant count for a particular month, it becomes really important to look at that participation start date. So I'm going to run this for 7/1 through 7/31 because my grant director says who counted towards that report that TWC said we had X number of people as participants during this time frame. And when I run this report, it becomes very important for me to look and see when did people actually become participants before I say this is how many people we're counting in this report. So it would be very easy to, at a glance, I'm going to take out a row here, and say we had 28 people who counted during that month because I ran the report for 7/1 through 7/31. However, one thing I didn't notice is, or one thing I maybe didn't look at is, when did those individuals' participation actually start? And I've got a few people in here who, even though they had service during that 7/1 to 7/31 date, their participation hadn't yet begun, meaning they didn't count on that report. So one quick and easy, dirty way to do this to kind of see who's actually being counted on this report. And again, there's a lot of different things you can do depending on your skill set of Excel, would be to actually just sort by that participation start date. And now I can see, okay, these are the individuals who had a participation start date that was between or prior to 7/31 of this year. And so these are the people who are counting because they had service during 7/31 or 7/1 to 7/31. So I'm going to stop there. Again, please don't hesitate to type any questions into the chat pod. I haven't seen anything, want to make sure I didn't miss anything. So the next thing I want to show is I want to talk a little bit about kind of making you think back to your performance accountability event and kind of how a period of participation carries across program years and what that looks like in the context of this report. For this, I'm actually going to have to pull up some information that I ran before this session, and I'm going to actually need to go to our test environment. And the reason I am not able to do all of this for you live in the test environment is that our test environment has real data in it. So I had to go in, add some fake information, but create some kind of fake reports to be able to show you the full trajectory of what I want to show you here. So I'm going to go to my fake participant that I made before our session here. And my participant, Jeremy, here, had a period of participation that started last program year. His first direct contact hour was 1:23. He had a participation start date of 2/6. Now, this is actually kind of a twofer here. The information that is populated, so if you'll recall, I said that the reason the report takes so long to run in the system is because it's calculating everything real time. That is not the case with what appears on this screen. What appears on this screen, unfortunately, does have to be rerun every night. So if you are just banking on this information on this page and you look at it, it may take another day, or it will take another day to catch up. And so some of the information that I have in here, you kind of see I've been going in and adding some new information, taking out information to kind of create the scenario. So I will tell you, so this individual, for example, you will notice as I kind of play with this sample here, this Exeter flag is going to say yes on this screen, even though it's going to show differently in the report. So just an important piece of information to kind of show you, to give you an idea of how an individual kind of gets carried forward across the system and how that information actually gets calculated. But what I'm going to do with Jeremy is Jeremy has not had service for quite some time, and he was an Exeter for this program year. His last service date, again, this Exeter flag, is right now. It's going to change here, or it's not going to change as you would expect it to in a minute. But his last service date was 5/8. So for him, I know I can count. It has been 90 days since his last service date. Now, the rules of performance accountability that I learned at my performance accountability session tell me that all Jeremy needs to continue participation is one of those participatory services. So if I think back to my participatory services, I know that he just needs one of these things to continue a period of participation. Now, that is correct. However, For the purpose of him actually counting as a participant in the new program year, for the purposes of enrollment, for the purposes of measurable skill gains, he is going to need greater than 0 contact hours to actually start counting in the mix. And the reason that is that for our data system purposes, everything for periods of participation and counting towards measures is driven by funding codes. But the only services that are actually tied to funding codes are those contact hours. So I'm going to need a service tied to a funding code to actually start counting towards those measures. However, the thing that prevents is a situation where you have somebody who, let's say, ended service last year, and all they do this program year is get a test. That prevents a situation where that person now counts in my performance for this program year, even though they just came, got a test, and let's say it wasn't even anything that would count towards my performance. Another situation is somebody comes this year and just has a career service. That individual, if I were looking at those contact hours across each program year, is now going to count in my performance, even though all I did with them this year is give them a career service. So while those participatory services will continue a period of participation, for purposes of actually starting to count towards your measures, your enrollment measure, your MSG measure, they have to start accruing contact time. And it's essentially greater than 0, but have to start getting that contact time before that's the case. And so I want to show a few examples here. And again, I actually ran the reports for this example beforehand because the system does have real performance data in it, so I had to go through and redact some of the information. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a career and training service for Jeremy here, and I'm going to add it for the beginning of this program year. I'm going to say I gave him a referral, and I referred for child care. Now back on the screen, you'll see, as I mentioned before, my Exeter flag has not recalculated, and that's because, again, that gets calculated nightly, but my last service date has updated. And so now I've seen that this individual, he does have services in this program year. And if I were to go and run my period of participation report for this program year, and sneak peek, this is what it looks like, I'm going to see he does appear, and I ran this for this program year, and he does appear with the last service date of 7/1/2018. So if I were to have run this report to see who's counting towards my enrollments, I could easily say this person had a participation that started before this program year. They had service in this program year. So in my brain, I'm going to think, oh, they should count towards this program year. So it becomes important to look a little more deeply and to actually look and see when he had his last contact hours. So while he had a service, 7/1, he hasn't had contact hours since 5/8. So in order to see who's going to count towards my enrollments this year, I have to not just look at who is a participant on or before this program year and had service in this program year, but I also have to look at when those contact hours took place. So kind of 3 different factors I have to look at to determine whether or not Jeremy would have counted towards my enrollment during this time period. Because he hasn't had any contact hours this period, he's not going to count. However, let's say, for our purposes, that I do add some contact hours for him in this program year. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to add, and I've actually, for our purposes here, I've already added a class registration, and I'm going to add some contact hours here. And I'm going to go back, and I'm going to run my report. Run my report again for this program year, let's just say first quarter. And now when I run that report, he's actually got a situation where he's got services in this program year, but he also has contact hours in this year. And so for the purposes of counting towards my PY1819 enrollments, he's going to count. So you have to start to kind of learn to play with the different information in the report to tell you who's going to count towards what time period and how all that's going to play out for the purposes of counting your enrollments for that time period. So again, it's not just a matter of having service in the new program year to continue your period of participation into the new program year. It's also a matter of actually having contact hours in the new program year for purposes of continuing into the new program year. The next thing I want to talk about here, and again, I guess I'll stop real quick and make sure we don't have any questions. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about the time frames for the report. And so this gets us back to the report I was showing you earlier that I ran for 7/1 through 7/31 and ran again for 7/1 through 9/30. So I want to now look at another individual and just kind of take a look at the different information. So now I'm going to go to Mr. Carver here, and I'm going to scroll all the way over to my contact hours.
Before we move on, Carrie, we did have a question that came up. Do you want to go ahead and address it now?
Go for it.
Okay. Is the minimum to direct contact hours to count towards performance more than 0, or is it 1? AEL 0818, page 3, says at least 1 direct contact hour. Would someone with 0.25 hours count?
Right. So it's kind of two different things here. So for the purposes of counting towards in the new program year, it's greater than 0. For the purposes of counting towards one of the discrete targets, it's 1. So it's kind of two different things. Now, I do have to say, and I do want to check the language in 0818, because the whole greater than 0 thing, we've actually added that language into our POP letter, but did want to go back and make sure that the language in 0818 was consistent and that there wasn't anything kind of squishy there. But it's kind of two different things. For the purposes of counting in the new program year at all as a participant, it's greater than 0, so 0.25, because everything is calculated in those those quarter increments. But for the purposes of counting towards a discrete target, so let's say your IET target, it's being a participant and at least one of those hours being in that specialized funding code. So slightly different, two slightly different things. But I haven't actually looked at 0818 since we added in that new language or discovered that new language after the first of these events. So I will double check that, Cameron, just to make sure that that language is consistent. But excellent question. And I'm gonna kind of move on here, but if I do see another question, and I'll keep a loose eye on here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of show you again some samples where an individual has kind of different things going on for a different series of time, for lack of a better word. So I'm going to freeze my cells here again, just so I can kind of show this to you. And I'm going to hide some of this information so that you can see this a little more clearly here. But John Carver, again, my blue represents what I ran for 7/1 through 7/31, whereas my yellow represents what I ran from 7/1 to 9/30. So what's important here is, and if I scroll all the way over here, you see that when I look at my total hours, they're actually different for the two time periods. And again, that's because hours are a snapshot, whereas the other information, so for example, last contact hour date, is always going to be whatever the latest information is as of when I ran the report. So so what this tells me is as of 7/31, this individual only had 453 contact hours total, all sources. As of 9/30, they had 537 contact hours, all sources. And I can actually see that there was no difference in basic education, so a little added piece of information. I know that those were training. And I could actually then go in and compare the training hours from 7:1 through 7:30 to the training hours for 7:1 through 9:30 so that I could see the distinct difference there. But for the purposes of kind of looking at information for a snapshot versus what it is as of that date, it's important to keep in mind that those hours, the hours only for the different sources, are always going to be whatever happened within that time frame, whereas everything else is going to be what information do we have as of today for the relevant time period. So the next thing I wanted to show is some samples of how you can actually filter this report. And give me just a second. I'm going to go back to my Teams train environment here. Again, if you've kind of been playing around with this report, you've probably already seen that you have the ability to filter this report by different factors. Obviously, what we've sort of been playing around with are the time frames of the report and how you can run the report for different time frames, but you can also run the report for different factors that we will take a look at here. Grant recipient, obviously, is going to be for the time period that you selected, but you also have the ability to filter by provider sites and classes and by participant. So what this allows you to do is this allows you to, for the purposes of if you have multiple providers, so Cameron, great example, in a large consortia, can actually see who has overall a period of participation by running the report all together, and then across each of my providers, who has been served by that provider. And if I select a provider and run the report, only people that have had services by that provider are going to show up on the report. So if I run the report here for 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, D, it is going to show me this group of information. So it looks like about 22 individuals. And then if I ran it again for ABC 1, 2, 3, and you will notice, let's see here, I've got, and I'm trying to make sure I don't double count anybody, about 26 individuals. Now, one thing I want to point out is if an individual is served by both providers, they're going to show up on both reports. So Dolly Wise down here, you can see, it's going to be silly for me here, but Dolly Wise down here at the bottom was actually served by both providers in this situation and is going to appear on both reports. The other thing I want to point out is that that information is going to be duplicative across the board. So it's not going to give you contact hours, let's say, for just that provider. It's going to give you the contact hours across all providers, the participation information across all providers, but she's not going to show up on the report unless she's actually been served by that provider. So important distinction for when you are running the report, but keep that in mind because if you are in a situation where you're trying to check enrollments across all of your consortia partners, to see your all-together total, you're going to need to run it all together first and then run separately across each of your providers. Otherwise, you will wind up with duplicates in the situation that you have an individual that's been served by more than one provider. The other thing that you can filter by are different participant factors. So you can obviously filter by employed or employment status, your age statuses. This is going to be all information as of the date range that you ran if they were a participant as of the date range that you ran. So when I say that, if you run this report for, let's say, your 16 and 17-year-olds from 7/1 to 7/30, it's going to look for anybody that had participation during 7/1 to 7/30 who was a 16 or 17-year-old as of their date of participation. You can run by distance learning type, so people with absolutely no distance learning activity versus people who are categorized as a distance learner, meaning they have more than or 50% or more of their hours as proxy, and then anybody with proxy hours. You also have training hours, so you can run for participants with or without training hours. This can become particularly useful when you're trying to check to make sure that people who are in IET actually have their training hours selected. And then you can run by all the different profile variables. And again, this is going to be as of their participation date, or as whatever their profile was as of their participation date, rather. It was originally on the table when we were talking about doing an extract to actually just have columns for all of these and indicate yes, no, whatever the status was, but due to the urgency of the report and the amount of time that it was already taking to create the report, we opted for just allowing you to filter the report. So if you wanted to actually add all of these in as a different column, for example, you would need to run the report by the different categories to then indicate in your overarching report whether or not somebody, let's say, had a disability status, veteran characteristic, et cetera. But it does allow you to run the report that way and filter that way. The last piece of filtering that I wanted to point out has to do with funding sources. This does allow you to see who's being counted as a participant for a particular funding source. And again, because this is all driven on the funding sources associated with contact hours, what this will essentially do is allow you to run the report, see who had service in a particular contact hour, and then whether or not they were a participant. So if I wanted to see anybody who was a participant who had services in, let's say, one of my IET funding sources, I'm actually going to clear this out real quick because I'm never quite sure if I've selected any filters that are going to mess up our report here. But if I wanted to see individuals that, let's say, were being counted towards my IET target, I could actually just run this report for my IET funding sources that are in AEL 0818. I could run my report extract, and I could do it two different ways, really. I could select participant, or I could just pull the report. This is everybody who's had service with that funding code, and I'm only going to take a look at my participants, which in this case, everybody on this report is a participant, so I'm good. Again, this is participation based on all funding sources, not just the funding source of the funding code that you selected. So this is telling me this is everybody that's being counted towards that particular target. I want to check my little walkthrough here to see if there's anything else I wanted to point out. I think that gets into most of my filters that I wanted to make sure I covered. So we have about 15 minutes left. I will stop and ask if there's any questions. Again, this is kind of a first stage. We will do more of these types of sessions to kind of walk through, answer questions about the report. So other questions? And I'll make sure with you, Beth, that we don't have any other questions floating that I've missed.
There's not any that you've missed.
Okay. Well, with that, I guess I will say thank you all.